I think the difference between the standard of observation in that page and the passage from Henry V is evident. In the whole of Hall's book, in fact, there's not a striking clinical observation. Indeed, close observation of the kind that Shakespeare made, let alone physical examination of a patient, was regarded as beneath the dignity of the physician because he was a learned man who was in possession of a theory that was deemed all-sufficient and all-explanatory, namely the humoral theory of Galen. And when Hall said of the radishes applied to the sole of his patient's feet, that they hindered the recourse of vapors, he had actually observed nothing because he didn't need to observe anything. He knew what had happened because his theory had told him that it must happen. Shakespeare was so accurate as a clinical observer, therefore, not in spite of his lack of medical training, but because of it. Combined, of course, with his natural genius. Yeah, I think I should wait. Yes.
Why don't we go on? And Tony, if you will go back to a, if you just go back to a paragraph.
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Thank you. Well, Shakespeare was so accurate a clinical observer, not in spite of his lack of medical training, but because of it, combined, of course, with his natural genius. He had, had he trained in the school of physic in which his son-in-law had trained, it's likely that his powers of observation would have been decreased rather than increased. He knew the Galenic theory, of course, but and he uses it as a metaphor in many plays, but he was not enthralled to it. Well, it often seems to me that many intellectuals in the Western world have acquired, or perhaps learned, is a better word, the kind of blindness brought on by dogmatic theoretical propositions of the Galenical kind. And they approach the world much as Dr. Hall approached his patients, with an unshakable theory that led and leads to absurd and often dangerous prescriptions. The patient's survival is in spite of and not because of the prescriptions of the doctor or the intellectual, and is attributable to his strong constitution. However, any constitution can be undermined if enough clysters, sudorifics, emetics, diuretics, venesections, and purges are given. My book, then, is a protest against the blind disregard of reality caused by theoretical presuppositions that seem to me at least as absurd as Galen's humoral theory. And as to why people adopt theories that are in conflict with the most minimal honest reflection and observation, I'll quote T.S. Eliot, who, while not always right, was in my opinion right about this. Half the harm done in the world is due to people who want to feel important. They don't want to do harm, but the harm does not interest them, or they do not see it, because they are absorbed in the endless struggle to think well of themselves. Well, he might have added the endless struggle to look well in the eyes of their fellow intellectuals and fear of losing caste. And it is against this dereliction of duty that I have written. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
That was wonderful. Under the circumstances, great. We have time for some questions. And do we have Michael Barrera with his microphone? With two microphones at either end of the room. So those of you who want to ask a question, please wait for the microphone so that our television audience can also hear what you're saying. Tony, I'll leave you to just point at random.
Hi, thank you. Have you, by any chance, I hear you're well-read, read Ian McEwan's novel Saturday? And if you have, do you have any comments about the portrait of the doctor that's in this book, and also the hospital conditions, and any theory about why McEwen might have chosen this particular setting?
I haven't actually read the book, so I can't really comment. Perhaps you can describe it to me.
I was curious to know whether it was in a regular, what kind of hospital it was in. He's a neurosurgeon,
Surgeon, yeah.
and he's a very upper middle class existence. And a lot of the medical procedures are described in the book also.
Would have to be Queen Square.
Yes, it would be difficult for me to comment without having read the book.
Yeah. You're a keen observer not only of what goes on in England, but what goes on in the United States. How would you assess the moral progress of the United States in the new millennium? The impact of the war on the national psychology, the impact of the Bush administration on our sense of self. Are we making progress, or are we moving backward? How does it look to you from across the ocean?
Well, to me it looks as if, certainly by comparison with us, you've made quite a lot of progress, because there's more resistance to the kind of processes that I've seen in England. So that although I suppose in certain areas you have everything that I describe in my book, the main difference between Britain and America is that in America it's a relatively small proportion of the population, and a fairly easily defined part of the population that suffers from or has the kind of problems that I describe, whereas in Britain it's actually the heart of the population. And there is also a much more obvious spread, as far as I can see, into the upper echelons of society of the kind of behavior that I talk about. So I think America is actually a much stronger and healthier society, and is much better able to defend itself, or much more willing to defend itself against what I'm talking about. So I would be much more optimistic about the United States than I am about Britain.
If I could just follow on that, do you have a sense of why? Because reading what you write, the social pathology makes me so glad I'm here. But the influences of the welfare state are similar. Why have we done better? And crime is dropping here.
Well, the government claims that it's dropping in the United Kingdom as well. The trouble is that our government is so corrupt, we no longer believe any statistics that emanate from it. I think the difference is possibly that the political class in Britain has a sense of guilt, or pretends to have a sense of guilt, and feels that it can't actually criticize those, an implicit criticism of those on a lower scale than themselves. And there's certainly a great deal of populism, cultural populism, amongst the political class. For example, just to give you one small example, when the new government, the then new government came in, the government of Mr. Blair came in, I looked up all the government ministers in Who's Who. And I was interested to see what their interests were. And practically all of them, I think about 8 out of 10, claimed that and it was their only interest, was football. Now, I'm not quite sure whether it was true that their only interest was football, or whether they were just claiming that. And I'm not quite sure which would be worse, whether they were telling the truth or whether they were lying. But not a single one claimed any, what one might call, more elevated interest than that. There's certainly a feeling in Britain that to behave badly is actually politically virtuous. It is, if you take, for example, the public drunkenness that we see, it's politically virtuous because you're showing that you have no inhibition. There's been a kind of gestalt switch, so that those virtues which were previously extolled have become vices.
And is that true in the United States as well?
It isn't. Well, certainly with regard to drunkenness, it doesn't appear to be true. Certainly one. I don't know about other virtues.